Welcome to the International Symposium on Alternatives Assessment Virtual 2020 Symposium on Current Practices and Future Prospects. To kick off our symposium, I'd like to introduce our Association for the Advancement of Alternatives Assessment President. Go ahead, Pam, and welcome.
Okay, thanks so much, Joel. I have to say I'm just thrilled as the president of the Association for the Advancement of Alternatives Assessment to welcome all of you to the first official A4 International Symposium on Alternatives Assessment. It was only 2 years ago at the 2018 symposium that A4 became a formal association. Since that time, A4 established its operational model while bringing content to our members to keep them informed and connected to the global activities related to the field of alternative assessment. In fact, our quarterly webinars often had attendance well above the number of registered members in our association. I see this as a confirmation of the interest in alternatives assessment and informed substitution, the important role for A4 in helping to build that field, and the opportunities to be a resource to supply chains and regulators working to advance initiatives to bring more sustainable chemical and product options to market. The 2020 symposium, while virtual, will deliver interesting modules on current practices and future prospects of alternatives assessment. And I'd like to acknowledge the A4 Program Committee for rising to the task of bringing this symposium to our members amid the current challenges of the global pandemic. In addition, I'd also like to recognize the partnership with PCRM to help offer a special satellite training session, a neurotraining course, which is a subject that many of our members expressed interest in having further training on. Of course, all of this is being offered free of charge, and this is in part due to the generosity of our sponsors. And so I'd like to really acknowledge the sponsors today and thank you for supporting this symposium. Without your help, it wouldn't be possible. The Department of Ecology, Washington State, 7th Generation, State of Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, the Angus Chemical Company, the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, and Tax Services. Again, thank you so much for the generous support. And then I'd just like to end with saying, let's not let the virtual nature of this symposium detract from having the important discussions and making the fruitful connections that we need to have in order to advance the field. I know these are often so much more easier in person, but as I've looked on 2020, I have to say that my word for 2020 is determination. I'm too positive to be doubtful, too optimistic to be fearful, and too determined to be defeated. And so that's how I feel like we felt about getting this symposium to all of you today. So please enjoy the content. Again, so happy to have you all here. If you're a member, please consider renewing. If you're not, please consider joining and enjoy the rest of the symposium. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pam. And let me welcome you again. My name is Joel Tickner. I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell and executive director of the Association for the Advancement of Alternatives Assessment. The Lowell Center for Sustainable Production, the research center where myself and my colleague Molly Jacobs work, and Molly's been behind the scenes getting this all ready and up and going, along with the A4 program committee. We're affiliated with the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production, which helps to support the management and direction of the A4. So today's first panel is looking at programs advancing informed substitution in Europe. You can go to the next slide, please, Molly. Give you a little context. The substitution principle has been built into European policies since the early 1970s in Sweden. And Europe has certainly been a global leader in policies and programs that push for substitution of hazardous substances. And more recently, over the past 5 years, there's been intensified attention to how you achieve more effectively substitution through support in evaluation and adoption of safer alternatives. And our speakers are going to talk a little bit about that. More recently, just last week, we'll hear about this, the European Commission published its chemical strategy for sustainability, which has a very strong opening section on the need for innovation in safer chemicals, safer, more sustainable chemicals. So this session is going to focus on recent European Commission level activities, as well as activities in 2 member states, Sweden and Germany, that are working to advance informed substitution and the use of alternatives assessment. In the work we've been doing with the European Chemicals Agency over the last several years, there's been many more countries that have been engaged in substitution activities, but we're going to highlight 2 of those countries. Tomorrow, we'll hear a bit more about this new direction coming out of Europe in Safe by Design, and efforts that are happening at the European Commission and the member state level to drive the design and application of safer and more sustainable chemicals. So let me introduce our esteemed panel for the session today. We could have brought in many more experts on substitution in Europe, but we thought this group would bring a great diversity of perspectives and efforts to the table. The first speaker is Dr. Matti Vainio, who heads the risk assessment or risk management unit of the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA. Matti is a regular at our international symposia. He braved the winter storm in 2015 to come to our first international symposium on alternatives assessment. And we'd like to say he brought back the lessons from that to help drive efforts around substitution in Europe. Dr. Tony Wickman is a senior advisor at the newly formed or recently formed Swedish Center for Chemical Substitution, which is located at the RISE Research Institute of Sweden. And lastly, Dr. Michaela Klever is a scientific officer in the Hazardous Substances Management Unit at the German Federal Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or BAWA, which now houses the new Subsport Plus platform. So all 3 of our speakers will give about a 12-minute presentation. Then we'll have time for panel discussion and then Q&A from the audience. So with that, I'd like to introduce Matti. Matti, you can turn on your video, and thank you for joining us.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I think you can hear me much better now. Okay, what I'm going to talk about is just give a bit of a frame on what we are doing at the moment in Europe when it comes to advancing substitution. We put the first slide, please. So first, one word about ECHA. Excuse me, I just put my button up. We are an agency of 650 people in staff coming from 28 countries, member states in Europe. And what we're doing in Helsinki, we're operating the chemicals regulation of the union, mainly the REACH regulation, but also other aspects of it in particular in the future. We are dealing with data management, assessment of chemicals, risk management of chemicals, and also impact analysis of chemicals. Next slide, please. The first sort of frame to my presentation is to look at the so-called Green Deal that was made by the European Commission to the Parliament and the Council, and which was then adopted together with them. And that's actually a big deal. It is sort of this sort of the strategy of the Union of how to move forward in the next 5 years, which is kind of the term of the Commission. And the main goal is to make European economy more sustainable. And there are 3 sort of pillars in that. One is to have no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. And this is a big goal. The economic growth would be decoupled from resource use, and this gets closer to chemicals already. And also sort of solidarity principle that no person or place is left behind in Europe while doing so. There are several ambitions and actions in the program. I will not obviously be able to go through that in this presentation at all. But there is one action which is about zero pollution ambition for toxic-free environment. And under that, then there is sort of a one action point, which is the chemical strategy for sustainability. If we take the next slide, please. I will not go through all the details of that because I understand Søren Bovard from DG Research is going to be talking about this tomorrow. But couple of main principles about this. First, it's about there's a sort of an aspect of innovation for safe and sustainable use of chemicals, and it has a component called safe and sustainable by design, and this is something which, as far as I have understood, is very much something that is funded by DG Research, and therefore certainly is the best person to explain this more in detail and how that links with substitution. One aspect in the chemical strategy is to come up with the development of criteria for safe and sustainable by design for chemicals. Then setting up a network to support safe and sustainable design. Then there will be financial support to companies, and this is where DG Research, the Director General of Research, and comes in particularly in. And then there will be competence building, excuse me, on different aspects of safe and sustainable by design. There are some other aspects there as well, like minimizing the substance of concern in products. So these are sort of reduction of toxic substances in products, innovation in industrial production to get more novel and clean industrial processes, and strengthening of EU's strategic open strategic economy, essentially to get the sustainable chemicals value chain in more and more into the regulation as well. There's also another aspect which is very important, is to have a stronger EU legal framework, and that of course is then what I would call the normal business of what the Commission is doing and what member states are doing when regulating chemicals, so strengthening that even further. And in particular, there would be a call for making restrictions on those substances. Next slide, please. Now, our own substitution strategy is sort of a, I don't know if Joel you would agree, but kind of a prelude to what was going on in the Green Deal and in the chemical strategy under the Safe and Sustainable by Design. We published our strategy in January 2018 after consulting with member states, and during the preparation we collaborate a lot with Joel and his team. And you can see now some similarities between the two, and they are sort of, as I said, we are sort of a small agency in the big union, helping in our small role to make things better in terms of substitution. So the first thing that we have in our strategy is to promote best practice in alternatives assessment, in substitution, and actually in a mindset change that people would see substitution as differently from what it's been maybe used to seeing before. The strategy is to support regulation, not to replace it, obviously. And I will not have a chance to talk about what I call main business, which is authorization applications, or another very important business, which is restrictions that we are working together in ECHA. In authorization applications, we have received about 300 applications for authorization, and each and every one has an analysis of alternatives assessment over there. Under restrictions, we have maybe 30 of them at the moment. I put a link, by the way, to my presentation, so if you get it, you should be able to get to the relevant pages from here. Other regulations that we do is in ECHA is the classification of harmonized classification of substances, essentially based on the toxicity. We also are now setting the basis for any development of occupational exposure limits, and you can see that part of regulation as well, driving substitution. Another aspect, and this is about the mindset change, to see substitution more as a part of innovation, to create business opportunities, and to have at the same time environmental and health effects. And here, collaboration with stakeholders, and I think this symposium is an example of that, as we see it, very useful and very helpful. Next slide, please. So this one is putting, in a sense, in a nutshell, what we are doing in the four aspects of it. We have sort of 4 elements of it: capacity building, facility and access to funding, which is the DG Research part in a sense, and that's relatively small, obviously, from our point of view. We just help people to the extent we can, for instance, through our website, facilitating the use of the ECA's data, which is a more an ongoing business. Then we have substitution networks, which are creating a sort of glue between all these different aspects. Next slide, please. The focus of our work for this year and next year is mainly on capacity building, and I'll give you a small example of that, and networking with stakeholders on substitution issues. In the longer term, we'd like to also work on more on the facilitation of funding together with the Commission, seeing kind of what we can do to help, and to facilitate comparative assessment of biocidal products. Depends, of course, quite a lot on our resources that we have, how much we can do. Next slide, please. On capacity building, what we have been doing and promoting is doing ourselves, but in particular promoting member states in the Union to have supply chain workshops. There's a slide at the end. I mean, I will not present it, but there's a slide which tells you the different kinds of workshops we've had. And here the idea has been that we as regulators try to help industry to actually talk to one another. It sounds a bit odd maybe, but we've seen that the producers of chemicals and the users of the chemicals and the customers of the users of the chemicals don't necessarily talk to very much to each other. And therefore, the substitution opportunities are not necessarily revealed very quickly. So the idea is to get these people together and talk to one another and see whether it's possible to substitute, under what conditions, and so on. We've also had online training on alternatives assessment and substitution. And here again, credits to our friends and allies on the other side of the Atlantic, where Joel and his team have been helping us out together with Molly. So that was very good and fruitful collaboration. And that training is of course available to anybody who wants to have it, not only for Europeans. Next slide, please. Here is a sort of a slide showing the networking that we're trying to do to boost sustainable innovation in the EU. You have different sort of hyperlinks where you can click, and Horizon 2020 is sort of European speak for funding of the Commission, and that's altogether 80 billion euros. So that's not small. So if you can apply for the funding, and Søren Bovard will be talking about essentially that aspect of it in a sense. On the left and right, you have sort of industry-related innovation boosting elements, which are also good for substitution. In the center, you have the Swedish Center for Chemical Substitution. So Tony, this is for you, and Michaela Subsport as well is also here, one example. So what we try to do in ECA is to ensure that people know about all these kinds of things, and therefore they can then get connected. Next slide, please. One example of what we're doing in terms of sort of checking how we are doing in terms of substitution. We had a study 2 years ago, and it was published early this year, when we looked at what is the driver of, for instance, substitution. The study has actually many other things as well. And regulation, unsurprisingly, is the driver. So about 15% said that authorization is the one that's driving substitution, whereas about 20% said restrictions is doing the same. But there are also others, and that's not unimportant. Own corporate sustainability policy is a driver in 13% of the cases as well. These can be mutually reinforcing as well. Next slide, please. I'd like to give an example of some regulation-driven substitution as well, which to me is a beautiful one, because not only we're talking about glass, beautiful glass made in Murano, Venice, Italy, but also because of these results. There was a requirement to get an authorization to use arsenic trioxide. Italian government funded these companies to find solutions to not use arsenic trioxide, and they actually found safe alternatives, process changes, and some glass types actually then they find out that they couldn't manufacture any longer, but they were able to find a solution. The interesting part is actually when I look at the air concentrations on the Murano Island, the concentrations were, before they made the switch, about 200 nanograms per cubic meter in 2014, and then 2 years later they were below 4, around 4 nanograms, so 98% reduction in arsenic concentrations. And just a reminder, at least in Europe, the target value for arsenic is 6 nanograms. So clearly an example of where innovation led into substitution, which led into improved health of not only the people who are dealing with arsenic, where I don't have any data of that, but the people living around those places where arsenic trioxide was used. Next slide, please. So taking home. REACH is a main driver of chemical substitution in Europe. But there are many other pieces of legislation as well, so we don't undermine that. Restriction and authorization under REACH are probably the main drivers in substitution. EU's chemical strategy for safe and sustainable by design is looking at, for instance, the criteria, networking and funding. And Horizon, as I said, 2020 has 80 billion euros in the kitty. It's not for substitution alone, it's for anything, any kind of research in Europe. And that's where the competition is high. And we see our substitution strategy as a catalyst. It's a small but hopefully influential way of getting people working together, institutions working together, and we hope that we're also catalytical in a sense in the chemical strategy as well, building networks, capacity, and getting actors in the supply chain to reduce barriers essentially to substitute. We recognize, and it's extremely important to also remember, that corporate sustainability commitments, in particular of innovative multinationals, can be influential. And we've seen the way examples also or giving that, and we want to boost that as well. So that's what I wanted to say about our sort of setup at the moment, the state of play at the moment in terms of substitution. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Matti, for that overview of several years of extensive work ECHA has been doing, which is on the ECHA website and the links that Matti has provided. As I said in the chat box, resources are available on the saferalternatives.org website, including the bios for our presenters. I did enable just now your ability to rename yourself if you wanted to do that, just so people know your organization in the participant list. You can just hit the 3 dots next to your icon and or under more in the participant list for you, and just hit rename. And it's great to see where people are coming from who are on the call today. We have 115 people here. So Tony Wickman, if you can start your video, and welcome to the symposium.
Thank you, Joel and Molly, for inviting me to this very interesting symposium and for giving me the opportunity to tell about substitution work in Sweden, about the Swedish Substitution Center and what we do. This is the Swedish politician Margot Wallström. She is not the only important person, but she can represent an important time in Sweden and in Europe that maybe explain a bit why Sweden decided about the Substitution Center to support substitution. During her time in the EU Commission, Wallström pushed the European Commission's initial proposal for REACH, the European chemicals legislation that Matti told about. At that time, we had a Swedish environmental law that states the precautionary principle, the product choice principle, and the polluter pays principle. And the Swedish Parliament had decided about 15 environmental objectives to be reached by 2020, with the overall goal to hand over to the next generation a society in which the major environmental problems have been solved. And the non-toxic environment is one of these environmental objectives. And for reaching the goal, Sweden has adopted strategic plans. We have procurement support and developed chemical supervision by authorities that leads in this direction, as well as NGOs and well-established eco-labeling. Swedish companies like IKEA and H&M have also been forerunners when it comes to high ambitions and substitution and finding alternative solutions. Complementary to legislation, Sweden has introduced a chemicals tax on electronic goods since July 2017 to increase substitution of harmful flame retardants. And the income to the state from this tax was last year $165 million. This tax is now under evaluation to understand if it has led to substitution, and so far it seems it hasn't been an efficient tool for industry to substitute flame retardants. Sweden is probably a too small market for electrical goods, mainly produced in Asia, and consumers can buy online to avoid the tax. And the taxation construction based on weight of the product and not on amount of the specific flame retardant might also have influenced. Anyway, there is a new decision to add a similar tax on textiles and shoes from 2022. Swedish industry is quite small, and even if there is production in Sweden, a large part of the supply chains for most companies is in other parts of the world. And although the awareness is comparably high in Sweden, there is still a huge amount of companies that are not aware of what chemicals they have, nor the toxicological aspects of these chemicals, or if there are substitutes or other alternatives. There is an increasing regulatory and market pressure to replace chemicals of concern with safer, more sustainable substitutes. And for many companies, substitution is really a big challenge. Especially small and medium-sized enterprises often lack the needed competence and finances to work with substitution. So the Swedish government decided to finance a substitution center about 3 years ago. This center shall inspire and motivate for substitution, transfer knowledge and good examples, collaborate and function as a node. Except for adding to the goal of a non-toxic environment, this was seen as a question of increased future compatibility for Swedish industry. The government decided to place the substitution center at RISE Research Institutes of Sweden, a state-owned research institute with about 2,800 employees. RISE has researchers strong in applied research, a large engineering competence supporting industry, and of relevance for alternatives assessment. We also have chemists, toxicologists, life cycle assessment experts, materials experts, modelers, etc., and labs with advanced instruments for analysis and testing, and about 100 test beds where industry can test different alternatives. As RISE managers saw good opportunities in hosting this center, it was also decided that RISE should add to funding of the center activities. And this is the Swedish Center for Chemical Substitution. Anna Jacobs, manager, me and my advisor colleagues Nina Melander and Anna Strid. I think all of us are attending this symposium. We give guidance when companies, industry and public actors ask for support. Often this guidance is related to regulation, toxicity, function, tools, or just to give contact to specific experts. The number of questions have been increasing as we have been more established with increased knowledge about our existence. We give short courses in substitution and seminars on specific issues related to substitution, mainly for companies that trade articles. We also produce a newsletter and just started a network of people in Sweden working with substitution in their professions. We also plan to give courses in the methodology of basic alternatives assessment. Except for us, we have colleagues at RISE that since 15 years runs a network of paying member companies, the Chemicals Group, mainly companies trading textiles and electronics. They arrange regular meetings, offer tools, inform about coming regulations, tell about each other's work on chemicals, and work together in research projects. As we are few people and should reach a lot of companies, including municipalities and others within the public sector, we are focusing a lot on our webpage. Here we have a substitution guide, films and webinars, good examples to show how others did, positive lists, tools to find alternatives that already exist, support material for those trading or buying articles and goods, tools and guidelines, subcontractor certificates, etc., to make it more easy for companies that don't know where to start and that have no good routines or competence in chemicals regulation. To find out about internal expertise among RISE 2,800 employees, we have started mapping and then to make a substitution platform for communication within RISE. Although, as I said before, RISE has competencies supporting industry expertise in areas relevant for alternatives assessment and about 100 test beds where industry can test different alternatives. People are not aware of each other, and we believe it will be even more important in the future to collaborate and to include more aspects when supporting industry than what it is now. We are also involved in Swedish-funded research and development projects, one with the name Mr. SafeChem, that includes a big consortium with the partners from academia, industry like Volvo, H&M, AstraZeneca, the Chemicals Industry Association and ChemSec, which is an NGO. Mr. SafeChem started this year and will be ongoing for +4 years and should give input to the development of methods and tools for alternatives assessment. And what about our involvement in alternatives assessment so far? Yeah, this year we are working together with the colleagues at RISE in some smaller technical projects where alternatives assessment is part of the work. Although RISE has expertise in the separate parts, there is a lack in working with more comprehensive assessments. So we take it as a mission to capitalize such work. We are also involved in some other larger projects with partners from authorities and public organizations and NGOs, universities and industry. And one of those is the POP-free project, where focus is on substituting PFAS for different uses like food contact paper, textile and leather, cosmetics, ski wax, firefighting foams and film forming products. As elsewhere, also in Sweden, there is a lack in methodological development and practice for making informed substitution and assessment of alternatives. And there is a need to convene the multiple disciplines. So our center sees it as an important role to be missionaries for alternatives assessment and to connect the different disciplines needed. And that was my last slide. Thank you. We are happy to attend this symposium and we hope to continue collaboration also in the future. And if you want to contact me, here is my contact information.
Thank you so much, Tony. We'll jump now to the last of our presentations and jump into discussion. Our last presenter, Dr. Michaela Klever from the German Occupational Safety and Health Authority. Michaela, you can start your video.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for the invitation to the symposium. So today I'm going to talk about SubSport Plus, one information platform for substitution, a tool to advance informed substitution. And the work Bauer has been done and prepared the relaunch now of SubSport. The next slide, please. First, maybe a few words what BAUER is doing. So BAUER is the Federal Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. It's a governmental research institution subordinated to the German Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. There are about 800 people working at 3 different German locations, Dortmund, Berlin, and Dresden. And main duties are, besides research and development, with the focus on safety and health at work, also the knowledge transfer and communication. And then we have the biggest working world exhibition here in Dortmund. And of course, we are also having duties in policy advice and sovereign duties in the scope of the chemical legislation, like REACH, you already heard about that, and CLP, and also the biocidal products regulation. This is also especially the work of Department 5, the Federal Office of Chemicals, as the German competent authority. They are also reporting to the Federal Ministry of the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety. Department 4, that's where I'm working, and we are hosting and looking after the information platform Subsport Plus, functions as assessment unit of chemicals with the special focus on worker protection. Next slide, please. So just a bit of the background. Why are we now dealing with Subsport Plus? So substitution of hazardous chemicals, as you all know and are aware of, is a central element under both not only chemical but also worker legislation. And to tackle new regulatory requirements, the need for high quality information about substitution was there. That's where was the reason why this EU LIFE project was started in 2010. And this was also the reason why BAUER Department 4 joined and helped in financing the project, which was initiated originally by the Kooperationsstelle Hamburg 10 years ago already. Together with other EU partners and experts, like for example, ChemSec and ISTAS, the information platform for substitution Subsport was developed in 2012. However, this project was not continued after 2014, and we decided to take over the portal in 2018. So I'm happy to announce that we are about to relaunch the portal after updating central parts of it by tomorrow already. So next slide, please. So what exactly is Subsport Plus? It's standing for Substitution Support Portal. It's an information portal for substitution to assist with substitution and the substitution process by the huge database of case stories where you can find inspiration of successful substitution cases. Then the providing methods and tools for substitution to assist with the process of substitution. Then by providing information on which substances should be substituted and for what properties. And the portal aims to support everyone who's seeking information on substitution. That means businesses, but also research institutes and authorities. And we want to integrate the platform as a useful tool in an EU-wide substitution network. One goal, of course, is to support the informed substitution and thereby contribute to a transition to a toxic-free environment. Next slide, please. So actually, what does Subsport offer? This is just a quick glance of how we reordered and sorted the features of Subsport. So there are actually now 5 pages, so regulation, substances, cases, process, and good practice, with 3 main pages on substitution. The core pages are cases. So here you find a database on case stories. I will explain this a bit more on the next slide. And these case studies of certain substance group also exercise and approach how to assess alternatives according to the original subsport methodology, which you can also find on the webpage. These serves, as I said, as an inspiration to implement and search for your own alternative. We added a few new information on other alternative studies and case studies from other sources to provide a most comprehensive overview as possible about what is already possible. For example, we also integrated 2 study reports, which we had here in Bauer on chromium trioxide and in-kind preservatives. These are quite new studies. Then on another page, we have substances, and there you find a database of restricted and priority substances. Now we have this list of lists, which actually contains 35 lists of international governmental NGO and company lists. There are more than 26,000 entries at the moment. And we added also the property of concern, which comes from the original source. For what reason the substance of interest on the list should be substituted. In addition, you can find there the criteria, how I identify the substances of concern, and different criteria which are used by institutions and also authorities in the scope of regulation. Then there is the third page, which is called process. Under process, we have the step-by-step approach how you can go through the substitution process and the instruments which help for each step, how to gather, how to assess the information, and finally consider in your substitution decision. We updated and added new tools. So after tomorrow, I hope you all have a look at that. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, the case story database was and is still the key feature of Subsport Plus. So there are more than 370 case stories of successful substitution in English available. We have 90 at the moment, still 90 translated into German. They are quality checked according to Subsport Plus methodology, which we also updated. And what you will find there is information on use. We added a few new categories like process, sector, function, and product category. Then you'll find substance information, hazard assessment, and the reliability of the information and availability of the alternative. At the moment, we updated 180 cases from these 370 cases, but we are also facing a few technical problems. And after relaunch, we have to import all the new updated information for each case manually. Okay, yeah, that's for the case story database. Yeah, next slide, please. We further have the page regulation, where you find a structured presentation of 26 legal regulations regarding substitution from EU and international level, which was also updated and was part of the original Subsport project. But the structured presentation then gives you a direct hint which articles or paragraphs are useful or address substitution, so that you don't have to search too much in the original regulation. A plus feature of Subsport Plus is the good practice page. This aims to assist and inform you about the safe use of substances which are currently not replaceable. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is still under construction, but to give you some idea and a preview what we are planning to put there. So especially because we are having the expertise of occupational safety and health, and cases where substitution is not possible are of particular interest for the the worker and how to handle these substances. So we want to place their substance-specific guidelines, for example, for handling chromium trioxide, or also product type guidelines for safe handling of biocides. So next slide, please. What do we plan with SubSpot Plus? Of course, it's a living platform. Yeah, we have to continuously update the information. We first have to finish our construction site, so finish the Plus feature of good practice, then make all the data available, and we will focus on updating the case story database with examples of successful substitution, and also plan to extend this database. We are also planning our own research projects to assess alternatives or to have alternative studies there, but we also depend a bit on external contributions from the users. At the moment, we are also evaluating about a dozen new cases from contributions to extend the case story database. Of course, in combination with our own research projects, we are also planning supply chain dialogue workshops to discuss with stakeholders the alternatives which we found, and then to see how valuable they are. Of course, by this, we want to strengthen the substitution network and make alternatives available. Okay, and then I'm already finished with my talk on this side. So thank you, and I hope you will have a look at SubSpot Plus from tomorrow on, and I'm happy to receive questions and feedback, of course.
Great, thank you so much, Michaela. I would ask our other speakers to please turn on their videos, and we're going to take a few minutes here. We're running a little bit behind time, but we'll take a few minutes for discussion with the panel, and then we'll do question and answer from the audience. So if our three speakers can get on video, and Tony, why don't we check your audio to make sure we can hear you well?
Okay, do you hear me now?
It's a little bit better, but I think if you look under the unmute button on your homepage, there's a way to change the microphone to the microphone that's. I think you might be on your internal microphone of your computer. So there's an arrow on the mute button. You can hit that arrow, and it tells you what microphone to use.
I don't know why, because it's.
You sound good now, Tony.
You do. Okay.
Is it better now?
Yes.
It's perfect.
Okay,
No.
it's perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm
Anyway,
very sorry for this.
No, we will,
It
the resource
works well.
online, and I'll ask you some clarifying questions. Well, let me start just quickly for each of you in order. What do you see as the biggest barriers and challenges to alternatives analysis or alternatives assessment and substitution? And how can government-led programs help overcome those barriers to substitution for companies? Matti?
I'm an economist, and I reverse your question, not the challenge, what's the opportunity? And I would think money talks, essentially. If companies, I mean, substitution happens by companies. I mean, it's not the regulators who do substitution. And if there's an opportunity to make money or to save money, then immediately companies start to look into that because there's an incentive. Money is very often linked, of course, to technology. So innovation is there immediately. So what governments can do really to spur innovation, which is sustainable, obviously, which is then not toxic, is to give research and development funding to those kinds of programs, or technological support, which can be even more important as well. So those are my first thoughts.
Great. Tony?
Yeah, okay. I think as most companies put regulation as number one to motivate substitution, I think the slow regulation is a barrier. And I also think the lack of transparency in the chain from chemical industry to consumer is a major challenge. I think
lack of information of chemical content in articles makes it difficult for downstream users to pull for substitution. And I think governments can push for developing a regulation and require more transparency when it comes to content information. I think that consumers, or for example in Sweden we have public procurement which covers about 78 billion US dollars every year, and if the public actors that buy all these things, if they are able to require more safer products, I think they would make change. It's connected to the financing question that Matti took up, although different. And I think this the RFID tags or product passports would help, so supporting that kind of systems. And I think funding for developing different systems would be a good thing for governments to do.
Great. Mikael?
Yeah, I agree with the other speakers. We also experienced when we were looking at chromium trioxide that their alternatives were considered when there was a need for innovation. Yeah, we have innovation on the one hand and substitution on the other hand. So it's like a stick and a carrot. Yeah, so for innovation, there are a lot of incentives, and substitution is more the regulatory push. But we need more innovation, more incentives for that. I think I would agree on that with Matti, but we also need the players to talk about this. So when there are alternatives available, it might be possible that they are not surviving on the market because they are not wanted. Yeah, so I think that's also a challenge, how to bring alternatives then on the market and make them sustainable there. Yeah, and I also think one challenge is to identify the right alternatives which are useful. Yeah, also in the terms of regulation, it's really hard and struggling for the applicants to identify which alternatives are really useful and have to be considered. Maybe there could be more help from the regulation side. Maybe the Commission could have more reports or studies on alternatives. Yeah, that there's in the end maybe a list of certain alternatives for a certain substance which needs to be replaced, and they say, okay, these alternatives you have to consider, and then you have to justify why are you not using them and substitute them. Yeah.
Great. So let me ask you a follow on, Michaela, from a question that came from a participant. BAWA is an occupational health authority, implements REACH as well, and there are several other occupational health authorities on the call today. What is the role, or how is BAWA engaging workers in its substitution processes, and how can they be more involved, since they're on the front lines of understanding, well, they're on the front lines of the hazards, but also on understanding process issues?
Yeah, substitution is one basic element of the STOP principle, right? So substitution is something which every worker has to consider in the hazard and risk assessment in the end. There is we have the technical rules for handling hazardous substances, for example, here on the national level, to give a hint where to look at, which alternatives are there for certain hazardous substances, but there's not so much push from the worker legislation in that. Besides the basic things which are there in the Chemical Agents Directive and the CMD, so the Cancer Mutagen Directive. So it would be necessary that DG Employment would push in that direction more, and maybe this is only partly described in the chemical strategy of sustainability, right? So there is the environmental part and the consumer part is much more described there, but how from the worker side, from the worker legislation, how this can be involved. This needs to be addressed more and yeah, more discussed in that sense.
Great, thank you. Let me ask a follow-on question about resources. We know that typically voluntary activities like supporting substitution tend to be secondary to regulatory activities in government agencies, which are the ones that agencies are often evaluated against. And also that many of the programs like Subsport and the Swedish Substitution Center, which have initial investments by governments, may not have long-term resources. So how do we develop the long-term resources to be able to support substitution, government substitution support activities? And let me start with Matti, the economist.
Money talks. I think it's still money talks. Can you hear me? Just to check the microphone. Yeah. No, I mean, that's a hard one, of course. I mean, there has to be an interest for somebody to fund something, and that interest, again, to more it is coming to, as far as I can see, comes back to research and development or innovation, or that somebody sort of sees an opportunity there. That's, to me, helpful. Obviously, governments can do things from their own funding, as for instance, we are doing a bit, or Sweden is doing, or Germany is doing. But fundamentally, the big money is in innovation. So if you get that somehow working together, I think that would be the way to do it. Another way to think about this might be to use revenue streams. And for instance, I think it was about 80 million euros a year that the Swedish tax is at the moment on the flame retardants is bringing in. Now, I don't know what the Swedish arrangement is, but you could just take a part of that, like 50% or 20%, and use that for substitution away from those flame retardants. It's a bit like alcohol tax is used in some countries to do research and development on how to get rid of alcohol or how to reduce the nasty effects of that. So using those kinds of revenue streams could be another way. Thanks.
Good. Tony?
Yeah, I agree to Matti. The Swedish tax, it is a big income for the state, and if we could have used all those money for finding alternatives for flame retardants in electronics, it would have been we could have made a big difference, but we didn't. So I think money is important, and I think also as a learning from our own center, I think it would also help if we focus on some specific areas, and yeah, that's lessons learned from Substitution Center in a way, that a very wide scope is difficult to manage with small money.
Great. Do you want to weigh in on that, Michaela?
Yeah, in my view, we need to find a more holistic approach on that. So I'm here at the Institute for Worker Legislation, so to speak, and we have other sister authorities, one for consumer and one for environment, and we are now working together, for example, under chemical legislation for REACH, yeah, where if substitution would be more centered there, yeah, I think it's getting more important, yeah, with the chemical strategy on the way and so on, yeah. But on the national level, we are having complicated ways to communicate among each other. So we have to get engaged more among each other to really find a common approach to that. Yeah, this is one thing. And then, of course, money and funding is something important. So that's why we decided to take over this EU project, so Subsport Plus, to have it here in a running institution. So it's now here and it's not going away. Yeah, so it will not stop as a project. Yeah, so this is something which is then sustainable. Yeah, to place it somewhere where it can have a future. in that sense that there are resources from maybe other parts. So we are then also strengthening substitution from the worker legislation, this kind. So this is one way, but I think there needs to be more also awareness on other governmental sides. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question and open it up for participants. If you do have a question, please put it in the chat box or raise your hand and we'll call on you. We have colleagues on this call from industry, nonprofits, from government, from academia, but we do have governments from many states in the United States, from Canada, and from several European countries and the European Commission. So how do we build better bridges and better collaboration between governments in Europe and across and internationally around alternatives assessment and substitution? What do we need to do to affect that? Do you want to go for it, Matthew?
Okay, thanks. I think it's sort of very simple. I mean, it's what we're doing right now. I mean, you need to talk, you need to communicate with people, and that way you can build bridges. And I don't think there's any other way at the end of the day. I mean, that it starts with some interaction, very often, hopefully, human interaction. And as part of that, there is actually a key thing, which is trust. If there's trust between different people with different interests, but still having trust in terms of what they want to achieve, which is at the end of the day some sort of a better world. Of course, our views of what a better world is might differ, but that the substitution is meaningful, that it actually pulls us towards a better society in the future. I think then you can actually get things moving. So I would build on those two things. It's nothing magic at the end of the day. It's just getting people engaged and wanting to do something which makes the world a better place at the end of the day.
Great. Tony?
Okay. I also think that maybe it's not governments, but experts that should meet as you do in A4 to collaborate and find solutions. And I think we should be better in sharing different alternatives assessments that has been done to learn from each other. It is complicated and complex, at least very often. So I think it's important to share. I also think we should work more on practical systems. I don't know if you know, but in Sweden for building material, we have different tools to choose the better building materials. I think that kind of tools could be shared or expanded to several countries. So I think that is, and I also think that ECHA, the work ECHA is doing in coordinating and trying to share information as good as possible is important, and this could be transferred between the continents, I think, too.
Great. Mikhail?
Yeah.
Sorry, I have one more also that I think is important, and that is international research projects. Mm-hmm. I've been involved in different European projects, and I really think those have leveled up a lot in Europe, at least. For example, the development of an application for consumers for candidate list content in when they buy things, they can choose, and that was a collaboration between most of the member states in Europe. I think that is also important things.
Great, and we can add some links to those in our links on the website. Mm-hmm. Great, go ahead, Michaela.
Yeah, so maybe to add a few things. So communication, of course, is also very important. I think it's also about defining goals, to have easy goals everyone can identify with and make them achievable. Yeah, so this constant discussion is good, but they have to be if they are really high reaching goals, then you have to define steps how to reach them. And I think defining these goals and then how to get there, that's quite important as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So let's go to our audience questions. Again, if you have a question, you can write it in the chat box or use the raise hand option on the participant list. We do have one question from Carl Palmer from the California Department of Toxic Substances Control. And Carl said he's willing to present or get on screen and ask that question. So Carl, do you want to join us?
Sure, thanks, Joel. Thank you to all our presenters. That's fascinating, and the great work you're doing is very inspiring. So my question is that, in the US, we tend to, in government, feel it's more our responsibility to hold the line and enforce, not necessarily stimulate innovation. So my question is, are there examples in the EU where government investment in R&D and innovation has translated into actual measurable benefits, not so much that you've prevented harm, but maybe that you've stimulated innovation of safer alternatives and better products. So on the positive side, because as Matti said, show me the money. And if we can demonstrate that the money is well invested, that would be helpful.
Can I answer?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the example I gave on Murano glass is a typical good one. I think their funding that came from the Italian government, I mean, I stand to be a bit corrected if I'm wrong, but it's about 300,000 euros. I mean, it was not that much money, but it was strategically placed on the glass makers. I mean, these guys are SMEs. They'll be making these glasses for, I don't know, 500 years, and they had to change. And it was successful. And the end result is that they are still in business and they're just dying less, if you want to put it very sort of bluntly, because they're no longer using arsenic trioxide, and the environment is in a better shape. So I think the only downside was that some white shades of glass could not be done any longer. So that's one example. There are several others as well. I can try to dig them out, but that's the one that comes to my mind immediately, obviously. Thanks.
Great. Nicola, any examples you wanted to raise?
Yeah, I don't know, but from Sweden, what I can think of right now is the funding of research, because we have had decisions about funding development of new alternatives. And what I think of now is maybe the one on PFAS, where it was a very clear message that we should find alternatives for PFAS in these different uses, for these different uses, and I think that that really made a difference. A lot of companies now work for or have already substituted the PFAS group from their products. So, and that was developed within these projects, but it was collaboration between several companies and the researchers and so on. But it was related to funding of research.
Great, thank you. Michaela, anything to add to examples?
I remember one example where we had this printing rolls, which were galvanized with chromium trioxide, and this company, there was also a need for innovation at that point, and they started actually also with an EU Live project, and to innovate this surfacing technology, and then they came up with PVD surface treatment of these printing rolls, because they have a much finer structure on these rolls, and this also then helps in the security prints where you need these really fine surfaces. So this was one thing, there was innovation necessary or needed. Yeah. So, and then they changed the complete surfacing process. Yeah, this was one example. Yeah.
Clearly, we need better data and better examples out there to demonstrate the benefits of investment in substitution. Certainly from the state of Massachusetts, we have them, and Also, there's some good examples from the EPA's, US EPA's Safer Choice Program, which Clive Davis, who's on the phone or on the webinar, has been trying to collect that information as well. We have a question from Jean Grundy from Health Canada, who we've been working with. Jean, I know you're willing to get on camera and discuss the question, so please join us.
Hi. Am I?
You're here.
Okay.
Yep.
Yay. Hi. I actually could address this to all three of the speakers. Thank you very much for your really great presentations. I'm very impressed, and this is really giving us a lot of information that we really are interested in learning more about in Canada. As we know, as Matthew said, industry is the one who makes substitutions. And we have heard from industry that there are many other considerations to their decision to substitute things, for instance, cost, formulation, regulatory status, supply chain problems. How much can you communicate with industry? You have to have a really close communication with industry, and it's and as I like the regulatory considerations, CBI. How do you encourage sharing? How do you encourage transparency? And how do you decide, or how can you have the conversation where industry's decision that something cannot be substituted is based on something that does not involve safety, but involves, for instance, cost or other considerations?
Do you want to start, Monty?
I try. I mean, so thanks for the question, Jean. It's not an easy one to answer because I think you're asking quite many questions at the same time. I mean, I think there are a couple of things that come to my mind. One is integrity, meaning that when government authorities are discussing with industry, there has to be integrity on both sides, meaning that they know what they're talking about and they know what they cannot talk about. And when it comes to CBI, for instance, we have to recognize that. And the other one goes back to what I was talking about, is trust, that there is sort of an understanding from both sides that you're not there to ambush, but to understand. And therefore you build, in a sense, a relationship that is trusting, in a sense, that then you see that, okay, the interest can be different, but at least the exchange of information to a point can be made. But after that, sort of, I don't know very much what to say. I mean, at least I believe that it's the communication has to be open, and you have to respect the CBI of industry, for instance. And then at least what we are doing, for instance, when we're discussing with them after the discussion, we ask, okay, I wrote a note and I want to know which parts of in my note with the discussion with you are something that I can quote and something that I cannot. So it could be very often I can quote a range, for instance, but I can't quote the exact numbers, just as an example. But you sort of build that takes sometimes a bit time. But then once you have it, so then it goes both ways. I mean, you can also then engage into discussion about what might be happening in the future. Again, keeping the regulator side, of course, clean, that you don't get into a compromised situation. But I don't know if that was what you were asking, but that comes to my mind at least. Thanks.
Tony, Michaela, do you want to?
I don't know if it's really adding, but I think the idea, at least as we understand it, the idea of alternatives assessment is much that you have a transparent, or at least a documented way of taking decisions. And in that case, I think it is a question of patience and a lot of communication between industry and authorities or whoever is involved in this discussions. So it takes a long time to get trustful relationships, but it's also important that the information is documented and you can go back. So if it's a question of economy or financial decisions that took. That was the reason why a specific choice was taken. I think it is important to lift this up, and maybe with the trust and patience, I think we will get further. Often you're not patient enough, and you don't understand that it will take time. A lot of things that we did or were involved in or have been seeing in Sweden at least is that you start something and you get the feeling that the industry is not wanting to change anything. They are very happy with how it is already. And then after a while, you may, after a year or two, you realize that they have started a work and they are working on substitution. So yeah, take time. It takes time.
Yeah, maybe I can also add something. So for our research projects, we usually also go through consultants, so who are already in the field, experts in that field, and have the connections. And then, of course, the companies are asked, which information they can share. So the consultants with us, so with the authorities. And if we don't get the exact numbers, we have then a qualitative description of what is going on there. If this is then enough for further decisions, we have to decide that then in each case, of course, because this trustworthy communications, of course, this takes really a lot of time, like Tony said, to communicate with the stakeholders, and then there maybe reservations at the beginning, but then it takes time to get and to overcome these reservations, right? So with the right consultants, you can have a way to for better discussions, of course. Another thing is in some processes under REACH, for example, we have also these public consultations with stakeholders, and sometimes you also then have useful information. It's just also worth it to communicate and discuss certain things. What do we see from the data we have from the registrations, and what the registrants want to put in a weight for our decisions. So there's communication and discussion, which is then necessary. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask a couple of, there's a question from Larry Brown from King County in Washington about the role of governments in creating demand for safer chemicals. And it'd be great, Larry, if you could come and join us for a second, and also Clive Davis from the US EPA to join us to talk a little bit about what's the role of government in creating demand signals, or creating demand, or helping to create demand for safer chemicals. So Clive, Larry, could you join us for a second? And
sure, Joel. Hey, everyone.
so from EPA, from your point, how are you working to do that?
Oh, yeah, thank you for the question. Thank you for everyone for, not just the speakers, but the insightful questions from everyone. It's so fantastic to be able to be part of this group. So, this is about the Safer Choice program, where we allow companies to use the EPA label on products that are that meet criteria for health and the environment. And by using that label, EPA's credibility to appeal to consumers, to purchasers, but really also to retailers, I think we've created an atmosphere that drives demand for safer chemistry. And we have seen chemical manufacturers, major chemical manufacturers, who have created market-ready products, either synthesizing new chemicals or simply making things like surfactants available in packages that are actually safer, biodegradable, lower toxicity. So I think that's a kind of an interesting, useful role, I think, for government in safer chemistry, and using something like the supply chain with retailers at the top of it or the bottom of it, if you want to think of it that way. The other piece, I mean, and Larry, I don't want to take any of Larry's thunder, because I think what he would say, but government partnerships where the federal government certifies these products, and Larry drives purchasing through King County in Washington, on the other Washington in the US, makes completes the picture, really. I think in a lot of ways serves the role of the retailer in the institutional space. So that is one model that works if you can get the right chemistry, if you will, to have a program that can drive innovation. That's a government program. That's frankly, actually, it's quite small in terms of government investment in the program. There are only about 10 folks at EPA who work on this, and then there's I would say, really a massive infrastructure that includes, in important part, Larry in driving demand and implementation, making it an interesting thing for companies like Procter & Gamble and BASF to invest.
Larry, do you want to weigh in? And we're going to hear more about all of the great work in King County tomorrow on the webinar.
Yeah, I was just going to mention our session tomorrow, where we'll have some King County businesses as part of that session. But yeah, I would say the ways we certainly have done it is education, educating the public, particularly recently a lot of work related to safer choice and educating the public, and really working with communities directly, and working with training community members the importance of safer alternatives, that then they go out in their communities and work with their own communities that they are from. So that's certainly a big way that we've been really trying to slow but sure move society towards safer alternatives. And we also have provided some financial incentives and things to really help out smaller businesses, and we'll be talking more about that tomorrow. But so obviously, as we've been talking about, money is important for a lot of these things, and helping small businesses kind of make that transition to safer alternatives can really be helpful for a small business. So
great, thank you, and we look forward to the session tomorrow. So I'm going to let our three speakers give some last words about that question about the role of government in creating demand, and also how this community can help you achieve the goals that you have with your substitution work. So just some quick reflections to wrap up, and then we'll close up the session with some last announcements. Matti?
Okay, again, money talks. Governments can procure green. I mean, that's one way, I think, which is clear. There's several others. From this community, at least what I think would be useful and helpful is to learn when somebody has done a good job in promoting sustainable and meaningful substitution, and why it was actually happening. And of course, if things are not happening that way, it would be good to hear also where something was happening, and maybe with good intentions, things didn't work the way they were supposed to. And then we get something called regrettable substitution. So I think it would be very good to hear that in whatever way, either more formally or less formally, but we can learn from that. And of course, we should be promoting substitution when it's meaningful. Thank you.
Tony?
To share alternatives assessments reports on common SVHC substances, and more supporting collaboration. Yeah, I think that would be good. More concrete guidance and practical support, and we should level up this together, because this is a worldwide need.
Great. Michaela?
Yeah, I also would like to hear what the audience thinks are there the problems in implementing an alternative, and what they see are the most difficulties to which have to be overcome. And maybe I'm not sure if there are any differences then from what we have here and from the situation we have here in Europe, and what is happening in the US and anyhow. So I hope I also will learn something more in the other sessions, of course. And I think it's good to communicate and have these discussions in this symposium.
So I just want to thank again our speakers for their excellent interventions, for Matti, Tony, and Michaela. Really thank you for joining us and sharing all of your experiences and knowledge with the audience. We look forward to more international discussions between all of the government agencies working to advance substitution. And again, I'd like to thank our many sponsors for making this event possible. And thank you, all of you, for joining us this morning.